Solidarity. Seems like such a simple idea, no? Togetherness, all for one for all, something like that. You'd also think that if anyone would be clear on the concept, it would be somebody like me. As Thomas said, after all, I'm a labor lawyer. Okay, I was a management side labor lawyer, but nevertheless, I know something about solidarity from the other side. Solidarity, of course, lies at the heart of the labor movement. It constitutes the movement's sine qua non. Without it, the movement collapses, and of course, that's true of any sort of association or polity. I'm also a comparative law scholar, and I do spend a lot of time in Europe, working with European, but especially German law. And that law is full of the language of solidarity and notions informed by it. So much so, in fact, that solidarity is one of the rights guaranteed in the European Union's Constitution. In fact, Title IV of the European Social Charter is devoted entirely to the notion of solidarity. Finally, I'm a Catholic with a strong interest in Catholic social thought. I've done a fair amount of writing in the area. Now, the reasons for that, of course, start with where I started off. If I'm going to be a Catholic trying to think with the church and working in labor, I ought to be somewhat familiar with what she has to say about this area. In fact, my first labor law class at Yale was postponed for a week because my professor, Jack Getman, had been invited to Poland by the Solidarity movement to address their first Congress in September of 1981. Some of you may remember that it was a few months later that martial law was declared. Well, despite all my contacts with it, the words always had a maddening vagueness to me. It seemed to have as many possible connotations as it's had users. Everyone from the Eastern Bloc governments to the Pope has used the term, and this came to some sort of crazed crescendo of cognitive dissonance, if you will, in the solidarity movement's very name. The solidarity represented by the socialist state and socialist theory ran headlong into the solidarity movement, which had strong ties to an intellectual grounding in the church. So I'm a good lawyer, and most good lawyers are troubled by vagueness. Consequently, I set out one day to determine just what the term meant and what its provenance really was. How long could that take, I thought? Well, it's been like 6 or 7 years, and I'm still working on the issue. Nothing is ever as easy as it seems when you start it. At the start of my little search, I ran across the following statement made by Nathan Glazer. Fraternity and solidarity are not familiar terms to us, he said, meaning Americans. And it would be interesting to know why. Well, interesting indeed. And I think very telling. It turns out that solidarity is what I might call an elemental concept. Tracing down its story puts one at the very heart of modernity, the struggles that have characterized it, and the choices, and I emphasize that term, often made by elites that have put us in the world in which we now live. The story of solidarity illuminates rather clearly why Europeans so often approach issues and think about them differently than we do. It also helps to explain why Catholics, and I might add Jews, have traditionally at least, thought about notions of community and obligations in a very different way than typical Americans have. Finally, solidarity provides an excellent mirror of American culture. It throws light on the basic fault lines that run through our society, including one of particular interest to me. Why American law, while providing formal protections for them, has such problems in dealing or comprehending groups and associations of all types. Well, I don't want to get ahead of myself here. Solidarity is a sprawling theme, and I think a very exciting one. G.K. Chesterton once wrote that we can ignore anything as long as it's big enough. And the story of solidarity is really a story about ourselves, and one that raises the biggest and most troubling and therefore the most earnestly avoided sorts of questions. Who are we? How are we related to one another? And what do we owe others and owe ourselves? Well, in the time I have today, I'd like to address these issues, and I'd like to go about it in the following ways. First, I'd like to look at the sources of the term solidarity, where it came from. Secondly, I'd like to turn to look at why it arose, what forces brought it about, and how it developed. I'd like then to turn to the notion for a few minutes to talk about what solidarity actually implies. What does it really mean? I'd like to turn then to take a quick look at the stories of a couple of the authors of the notion of solidarity and their ties to Catholic social thought, how they helped develop it. I'd like to spend a minute or two talking about how the meaning of that term split in so many directions. And lastly, I'd like to leave with a couple of questions. So let's start by looking at the sources of the idea. Father Joseph Tischner. Tischner was a colleague of John Paul II's. They taught together on the theology faculty at Lumen. He was also one of the advisors to the Solidarity movement. In his book on solidarity, it's a lovely little volume, he writes that history creates words in order that, in turn, they may create history. Well, this seems very true here. The term actually began to creep into use on the eve of the French Revolution. Turns out it was plucked from the Roman law, where an obligatio in solidum refers to a situation in which two persons, two or more individuals, share a common indivisible liability for or entitlement to the whole of a debt. Defined in this narrow sense, the word solidaire appeared in the first edition of the Dictionnaire de l'Académie Française in 1694, and shortly thereafter in the Encyclopédie of Denis Diderot and Jean d'Alembert. Voltaire, however, would be the first to free the word from its legal tethers and to loose it into common speech. In the 1770 edition of his Dictionnaire philosophique, in an entry entitled Jésuites or Orgueil, that's Jesuits or pride, he said the following. He reproached the Jesuits in this little entry for what he called the sin of arrogance. While men of rare merit, he wrote, can be found amongst their ranks, of this singular society, he declared, mediocrities make up its greatest number. Voltaire then went on to recall that Henry IV had conditioned the return of the Jesuits to France in 1595 on the presence of a member of the society at court to answer for the behavior of his ever troublesome confreres. To mollify the Pope, Voltaire explained, Henry used the hostage as his confessor. Thereafter, Voltaire notes, each Jesuit brother imagined himself jointly, or the word he used was solidairement, as the confessor of the king, and playing the role of the premier physician to the soul of a monarch. Mirabeau also used the term in the debates in the National Assembly over who would have the right to participate in politics, the important debate over active versus passive citizens. In the debate over his proposal that would have banned the children of bankrupts from being active citizens, he stated that the matter was extremely important because, he said, it matters to morals that they form the great spirit of a family, a solidarity in public confidence and in private confidence. It matters to society that the reputation of a father's strength becomes that of the children. It's a law of the family. That is to say, it is that to which we should aspire, to make one great family. E pluribus unum. Unity, creating and sustaining social bonds, or as Mirabeau says, making one great family. What more could sum up the sense that solidarity seems to convey? But why did it come into use then? Why did, to use Tischner's framing of the question, history create that word then so that history would then be created? Well, let's turn to look at why the word arose. And very quickly, it arose in response to the social question. Well, why did these terms, solidarity and the social question, arise when they did? To what did they refer? Perhaps the quickest way into all of this is to recall the events of the night of August 4th, 1789. The night that modernity, with its thematic and unconditional insistence on autonomous individualism, was born. That's the night that the August decrees were enacted by the National Assembly. The first sentence of those decrees in Article 1 says it all. The National Assembly entirely destroys the feudal order. Francois Furet notes that this night is the most famous date in French parliamentary history. It marks the moment when a juridical and social order, forged over the centuries, composed of a hierarchy of separate orders, corps, and communities, and defined by privileges, somehow simply evaporated, leaving in its place a social world conceived in a new way, as a collection of free and equal individuals subject to the universal authority of law. He writes that this night and this act constituted philosophy's destruction of a world. Well, with the decrees, the era of the self-made man, freed at last to worship his own creator, had come into the world. Writing just weeks after these events, Edmund Burke famously warned that in the face of the forces then being unleashed, what he so felicitously called the little platoons that gave society its structure and that knit them together would crumble away, be disconnected into the dust and powder of individuality, and at length be dispersed to the winds of heaven, leaving men, as he so famously said, little better than the flies of a summer. The English Company of Clockmakers sound the same note in an 1812 pamphlet in which they unsuccessfully defended the Elizabethan apprenticeship law, where they state that the enemies of the guilds are what they properly called the corporations. Corporations as we know them now, as we thought about them then, were very different things. At the same time, they wrote, condemn the whole political, commercial establishment of Britain, which is nothing other than a grand corporation composed of an infinity of smaller ones. Article 1 of the August Decrees embodies the insistent individualism that characterizes modernity and the political nominalism that lies at the heart of its political and legal project. A key part of the Enlightenment project is its suspicion of and enmity towards mediating institutions of all types. Now, of course, this has a long intellectual framework that led up to it. Thomas Hobbes in the Leviathan, of course, goes at some lengths to warn about the danger of what we now call mediating institutions. And he pungently, he's such a great writer, pungently described them as being like worms in the entrails of a natural man. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Hobbes' greatest opponent, similarly warns that when factions, partial associations at the expense of the whole are formed, the expression of the general will is threatened. It is therefore important, he wrote, that there be no partial societies in the state. But if it were impossible to suppress them, their number must be multiplied and their inequality prevented. Advice, of course, that was carefully accepted by the authors of the Federalist Papers. Adam Smith, likewise, this is in Volume 2 of The Wealth of Nations. Smith is, of course, sometimes called the most quoted, least read philosopher in history. Volume 2 is very little read, but very, I think, revealing. Smith is likewise insistent about the extirpation of mediating societies, his special targets being the guilds, the journeymen's associations, and the church. All of these he talks about in terms of being the system of Europe. Now, these theoretical propositions didn't remain such. They found very effective legal implementation. The famous Loi des Chapeliers is one of them. That was passed about 4 years after the night of the famous August 4th, 1789. The Loi des Chapeliers remained in force until the end of the 19th century, and its effect was to prohibit any sort of workers' associations of any sort. The changes wrought by these self-styled divine mechanics on the night of August 4th would quickly spread across Europe. With them, all the old structures and institutions that had once given society its form were razed, and the little platoons that grounded individuals and gave them what I might call defense and depth were dissolved. Furet notes that the West witnessed in this, in a very short period of time, the creation of a wholly modern individualistic society. The emissaries of the Enlightenment's demolition job was very thorough. The old Europe and the old Germany particularly are completely dissolved, one contemporary wrote. Wherever one looks, the eye sees only rubble. As Burke memorably put the problem, how is it that 3,000 or 4,000 democracies should be formed into 83, and that they may all, by some sort of unknown attractive power, be organized into one? Or as Mirabeau put it, how would we make one great family? Well, that states the problem. What had to be worked out now for this wholly new society of free and equal individuals, the old structures and the institutions that once integrated them having been wholly obliterated, what had to be worked out now was the character of the glue that might bind these sovereign, independent, right-bearing individuals to one another. That is the social question. In its fullest significance, the social question raises the most fundamental issues about human nature and the frameworks and possibilities for pursuing life in common. It sweeps matters concerning political, economic, and legal arrangements, the character of the family and work, and other social relationships, the role of the state, the place of civil society, etc., within its scope. The contests over these issues, of course, made up some of the most poignant and bloody struggles of the 19th century. In fact, that is the history of the 19th century. What are we going to do about the social question? Social architects as diverse as Karl Marx, John Stuart Mill, Alexis de Tocqueville, Justus Musse, Adam Muller, Franz von Baader, Herbert Spencer, Emil Durkheim, Max Weber, and the holders of the chair of Peter all proposed answers, and that's to name but a few. As the briefest glance at the world situation shows us, solidarity remains, if anything, an even more pressing issue than it was then. Well, demolishing the old edifices was the easy part. Coming up with something to replace them, while resolving the jagged problems that lurked amongst the debris would prove rather trickier. So let's look then at what solidarity implies, what it really seems to mean. Solidarity implies friendship, which is itself a very mysterious notion. We live with love, Jean-Luc Marion writes, as if we knew what it was all about. But as soon as we try to define it, or to at least approach it with concepts, it draws away from us. Friendship, a transcendent love for another, at whatever level or whatever sort. One can think about the levels of friendship in the Nicomachean Ethics, for example, is ruled out of court by the moderns. In his 1955 presidential address to the American Economic Association entitled, "What Do Economists Economize?" Sir Dennis Robertson answered his question in one word: love. The possibility of friendship, the potential for any sort of kenosis, a pouring out of the self, of a self-sacrificing love, is the thing that most separates the ancients from the moderns. For the latter, all relationships ultimately are self-seeking, limited in purpose and time, instrumental and contractual. I have no obligations other than those I freely accept. Any sort of heteronomy offends my sacred autonomy. And in fact, of course, in Kant's world, is absolutely immoral. In the post-Enlightenment world, a coolly rational self-interest supplants the more optimistic idea of friendship as the basis for society. As Tocqueville comments in Democracy in America, this, what he calls world altogether new, in this world altogether new, the instinctive love that once bound people to their country and their fellow citizens has fled beyond recall. For Tocqueville, of course, self-interest properly understood would be the replacement for that sort of disinterested love. Although by the very end of Democracy in America, it seems that women and self-sacrificing love come back into the question. To describe the ways that Catholics from Dante's time to Luther's thought about the character of personal and social relationships, John Bossy, in his lovely and perceptive history of Christian thought and attitudes, refers to the story when the comely young Beatrice, first greeted the infatuated Dante on a street in Florence, which he recounts in The New Life, La Vita Nuova. Bossi notes that Dante's reactions to Beatrice's greetings were the individual emotions of a pre-Raphaelite romantic love. More significantly, however, Bossi tells us that they were also social emotions. The greeting was a formal social act, Bossi writes, implying relationship. The effect was a coup de foudre, not simply about the girl, but about the social universe as a whole, a love that burned away the passions of hostility felt towards any person in it. The event, and Dante so describes it, was a social miracle. This vision of social beatitude, Bossi notes, conveys a number of convictions that were held axiomatic by Christians down to the time of the Reformation. The state of charity, he writes, meaning social integration, was the principal end of Christian life. Anyone who claimed to be Christian must somehow embody this, somehow at some time in the world. Well, salutation might initiate friendship, but institutions help to ground and extend it. The rise of the lay fraternities, which can be found any time after the conversion of the West and became universal after the 13th century, played this role. They can be found everywhere in Latin Christendom. Even the smallest towns might have 3 or 4 of these sorts of fraternities. We're told that in England, before the Reformation, the numbers of these fraternities was in the thousands. The goals of the fraternities were specifically social integration, that social beatitude. They were often made up both of men and women. There were typically no status or occupational restrictions. People typically held membership in more than one, and the goal of doing so, of course, was that it widened and thickened those webs of social sympathy. This, of course, is the same reason Augustine tells us in The City of God that marriage should be restricted by consanguinity. You have to marry outside to spread that feeling, that series of relationships. This was another attempt at doing so. Well, the guilds and the journeymen's associations, which we now sort of describe as unions, were specialized versions of these fraternities. I might add that in the spread of the fraternities, the Franciscans played a very important role. They played a great role in spreading the institution of the guilds across Europe. They also, of course, as I was saying, just also were important in the movement of the fraternities. The names of the rituals live on and indicate the purposes of these groups. The kiss of peace, which was given to each member when they met one another on the street and in their formal meetings. The Prandium Caritas, the love feast, which was celebrated 2 or 3 times a year. In Normandy, the fraternities were called Charité. And these fraternities undertook a dizzyingly wide range of social and caritative activities. In this sort of social order, as the German historian of work, Jürgen Kohler, points out, one might be at the bottom, but included, unten aber einbezogen. He uses the feast of Corpus Christi to illustrate this point. He's not the only historian to do so, by the way. As he points out, in the feast of Corpus Christi, each corporate body marched, fraternities, guilds, the guild men, the guild masters with the journeymen, etc., each carrying 2 banners, their patron saint's banner and the banner that indicated their trade, if they were a guild. Even the shepherds, the field hands, and the very marginalized poor had a place in this. They had fraternities of their own. They were all part of this. Of course, they all marched ahead of the Eucharist held in the monstrance under a baldachin as they marched through the town. In all of this, united by the Eucharist, the town's inhabitants marched as a host, each part of a smaller body that integrated them into the whole. It's a compact symbol of what solidarity actually means. The political theorist J.E.S. Hayward observes that it was amongst the Roman Catholic social theologians, his word, not mine, that the idea of solidarity first achieved its pivotal social significance and underwent an evolution that prefigured its subsequent philosophic prominence and temporary political preeminence. In Britain, he notes, feudalism and Catholicism had been eliminated as major political social forces by the early 19th century. However, in France, and I might add, in the western and southern areas of the German territories, Roman Catholicism remained an immensely powerful opponent of the individualist ideas that had swept all before them, almost unopposed in Britain. Therefore, he writes, it's not surprising that the church should become the rallying point for anti-individualism and that the appeal to solidarity should take the reform of a return to its political social constitution, even if its spiritual message had been rejected. Well, the one constituting an attempt to resolve the problems that lay at the roots of the other, solidarity and the social question would develop together, locked in a conversation that continues down to the present. Another way to talk about all this, yet unresolved argument over the character of our personhood, is that the notion of solidarity posits our relatedness in Eucharistic understandings, and it explicitly does so. To the founders of the notion of solidarity, community is possible only because of communion, which of course in Catholic theology means the union of, with Christ, to form a single body that transcends space and time, where the good of each is literally communicated to all the others. Throughout their writings, the idea of the revertibility of merits exemplifies solidarity, and it stands as an exemplar of its action. As Joseph Tishner put it, authentic solidarity is a solidarity of consciousness. It's a normative idea, and it makes positive claims on us. Well, at its deepest level, solidarity makes the claim that what the church teaches is true. Communion is not a mere symbol, that we stand in the divine presence and in that cloud of witnesses, as St. Paul describes it. Well, who came up with these ideas? Who authored them? Ideas don't come into the world fully formed like Athena from the brain of Zeus. It has progenitors. And that's true of the notion of solidarity. Solidarity, by the way, is the root of Catholic social thought. Everything else flows from it. It's the root for everything else that's in the teachings. Now, when most of us think of Catholic social thought, if we know anything about it at all, revered figures like Leo XIII, who issued the first social encyclical in 1891, Rerum Novarum, or the redoubtable Wilhelm Emanuel Freiherr von Kettler, who lived from 1811 to 1877, the Bishop of Mainz, whom Benedict called in his second encyclical his great predecessor in social teachings. Kettler, by the way, is just an amazing figure. He seemed to be part of every great event that happened during his lifetime. He was jailed twice during the Kulturkampf, even though he and Bismarck knew one another and had been briefly in school together. He was part of the debate at Vatican I over infallibility, where he and Lord Acton both were that group called the Inopportunists. He got an early excuse to leave before he had to vote. We tend to think of these people, but solidarity is a notion with many parents. We'd like to think that the parents of solidarity and Catholic social thought were pious and courageous types who led lives of edification, something like that led by Bishop Kettler. But that's not always the case. Some of the most influential, while indeed being very courageous, also had what we might accurately call today complex life stories. We only have time to mention a couple of them here. The first is someone that Harper's Magazine, in an 1854 article noting his death, called "That Strange Old Man," Felicite Lamine, a strange old man indeed. He's a man so famous that you've probably never heard of him. But he's easily one of the most influential men of his era, and his ideas continue to have impact on our lives today. It's very tough to summarize the life of Lamennais. He was a fallen-away Catholic who took his first communion at 22 and studied privately with his brother, who was a priest. We have to remember that during this time the universities had been suppressed, the church had had its institutions removed from it, etc. So much of Lamennais' teaching was autodidactic. He was ordained after some misgivings in 1816. He became so admired by Pope Leo XII that it's said that Leo kept a portrait of Lamennais in his chambers in the Vatican and may actually have made him a cardinal in peccato. Leo's successor, however, Pope Gregory XVI, condemned Lamennais' teachings, key parts of which nevertheless became core teachings of Vatican II. He drew an enormous circle to himself. People like Victor Hugo, Franz Liszt, George Sand, Cyprien Robert, Henri Baptiste Lacordaire, Dom Prosper Guéranger, who refounded the Abbey at Salem, Emmanuel Dazelin, and Adam Mickiewicz. Mickiewicz was a Polish Romantic poet, a great favorite of John Paul II's. In fact, he quoted him during his inaugural Mass when he was made Pope. Lamennais' work was also very well known to Alexis Tocqueville. In fact, he and Tocqueville became, Lamennais, of course, older, became political allies. Lamennais' influence was felt in a great many areas, but particularly through his short-lived but very widely read newspaper, L'Avenir, The Future. And boy, was it ever the future. This paper announced what it called a new Catholic liberalism, calling for the separation of church and state to protect the church. He was also a champion of ultramontanism because he thought that that gave the church more protection and more ability to operate. It's not the sort of argument one hears against ultramontanism today. He wrote in favor of liberty of conscience and religion, liberty of education, including freedom of religious education, liberty of the press, universal suffrage, and liberty of association, on which he spent a lot of time. He was also the first to formulate arguments for solidarity, for working people and the rest of society through a vibrant associational life to integrate those working people. He also makes the first arguments for subsidiarity. Without calling it that, he called it the right to administer ourselves. In his 1834 book, Words of a Believer, he called on the poor to organize and in their unity work towards a more just future. He also forecasts things like the role of the labor priest, and he uses those terms. He is also the first to say that the hour of the laity had struck, only 140 years before John Paul II told us the same thing. His book was a smashing success, which got him to huge trouble with Rome and with the liberal establishment. Gregory condemned it perpetually in 1834 in his encyclical Signulari Nos on the errors of Lamennais. This marked the end of Lamennais' life in the church, his public life as a priest. He'd eventually leave the church, but in a very serious way. The church never left him. His 1838 book, Book of the People, came at a critical time. The scholar Marie-Claude Blay writes that between the July Revolution of 1830 and the springtime of the people of 1848, a new actor, a new and unforeseen character, had erupted on the scene: the people. This new collective, set up in opposition to the bourgeois, could announce a terrifying social dissolution. And of course, Lamennais' book coming out when it does is timed along with Marx's Communist Manifesto. Lamennais' book posits the view that the distinction between groups is illusory. The class struggle, as he called it, reflects injustices, but not an existential clash of interests. a fact that reveals itself in the character of human work, something that he reflects on in a way that predates or prefigures the way John Paul II will write about it. The social question, the treatment of the marginalized, he says, is a moral question, and solidarity can resolve it and must resolve it. In the election of 1848, in the wake of the revolution, Lamennais received more votes than any other candidate, including Victor Hugo, his former student. Oh yeah, he heard Hugo's first confession. Along with Tocqueville, he was elected by the Constituent Assembly to be part of the Constitutional Committee. He submitted a proposal that began with the words to the committee, "In the name of God, in the presence of humanity in which all the people of the world are united in solidarity as members of the same body." And then the proposal goes on. He proposed starting the work of the Constitutional Committee from the level of government closest to the people, the communes. This was part of what had been called the doctrines of Laveniere. And this was a proposal that his colleague Tocqueville enthusiastically supported. Lamennais would resign, however, when a majority insisted on proceeding in the conventional enlightened fashion from the centralized powers of the state. Tocqueville wrote that he could not convince Lamennais to return, in spite of all I could say in the interest of the very ideas that we hold in common. How influential was Lamennais? Kenneth Rexroth points out, the essayist Kenneth Rexroth, that Marx, Engels, and Bakunin read everything they could get their hands on from Lamennais, enthusiastically, no matter how much they might have disagreed with him. And in the Revolution of 1848, he says, Lamennais was incomparably more influential than all three of them put together. That's undoubtedly true. Well, a second person I'd like to spend a couple of minutes with is Adam Muller, who lived from 1779 to 1829. If solidarity has two sources, two streams that come together, one is from the French and the other is from the German. We were talking about a little bit about this before the session began. You can remember in The Spirit of the Laws, Montesquieu has a very surprising line. The first time I read it, I burst out laughing. I've later discovered it was true. Montesquieu says, "Democracy was invented in the woods by the Germans." More to that than one might think. Adam Muller was called by the great Karl Mannheim the shaper of the thought of an era. He remains one of the most controversial intellectual figures of recent intellectual history, even today. Thomas Mann turned him, this thinker with a bad reputation amongst all the progressives, who says the wisest and most sophisticated things in the world about the political question, and in that ironic and conservative sense, which is the true sense and spirit of politics. On the other hand, the very talented, if equally dubious constitutional theorist, Carl Schmitt, called Muller an insignificant and questionable personality. But he nevertheless devoted not one, but two editions of his famous work, Political Romanticism, to attacking Lamennais. The literary critic and theorist Walter Jens referred to Muller's service as a spy for referring to Muller's service as a spy for Metternich. He termed Muller the favorite child of the police state. Yet, no one less than Hannah Arendt stoutly and deftly defended Muller in a two-part essay published in 1932 in the Kölnische Zeitung when the National Socialist movement tried to claim Muller as part of its intellectual heritage. Benedict Kohler remarks that Muller never got any good press, but he says, nevertheless, no figure in German intellectual history comes so often to mention as Adam Muller. Well, two versions of Muller seem to exist. With one stroke, writes Kohler, Muller, the enfant terrible of German Romanticism, changes himself into a person to be taken absolutely seriously, the respectable representative of a serious political position. He stands, he says, as the first systematic conservative thinker in Germany, and his work forms a fund of conservative thought. So what's meant by conservative here, and what did Muller contribute to Catholic social thought? Muller's conservatism is much like that of Burke's. Muller's going to do two things, essentially. He sets out an argument for, and thereby anticipates the development of, the sort of corporatist social and economic structures that later will be championed in the 1931 encyclical Quadragesimo Anno. This is a defense of a world that the liberalism represented in the work of Adam Smith and Immanuel Kant attack. The early followers of Smith and Kant in Germany bound the universalism of Kant's ethics with the utilitarianism of Smith's work. Both would accept the state only as an institution for the negative protections of a wholly abstractly conceived notions of human freedom. In all of this, Muller also tried to develop a theory of property which would remove its Roman law emphasis from the object to the subject of property, to its owner, as he wrote. As Muller saw it, one should understand property not as a right to a thing, but rather as an exclusive right to a certain free occupation, to a certain way of being able to work. Albrecht Longer notes that from the primacy of the spirit and morality, Muller will arrive at a theory of responsibility, one that binds philosophically grounded property and social doctrine with an economics based in solidarity. Muller, he writes, forms a weapon out of the idealist theory of property against economic liberalism as a whole, in which he found a thoroughgoing absence of moral orientation. Muller, in fact, once wrote to his friend and mentor, Friedrich von Gentz, who is the translator, the German translator of Burke, by the way, that he had devoted much of his life to fighting what he called the economic Anglomania of his time. Well, there's no time further to go into Muller's very rich legacy here. He was a core part of the German Romantic movement, and of course, Romanticism in politics tends to have a very bad odor, especially in the United States. But as Dieter Sturme observes, the values and ideals of political Romanticism in its late stages were conceived from a highly traditional perspective. It should not be overlooked, however, that this retrospective view was still directed forward. That direction marks the difference between a new conservatism and merely reactionary politics. Romantic premodernism, Sturme says, should not be mistaken for reactionary politics in every case, because its political strategies often aimed at an innovative cultural project. That was very true of Muller. Well, let me spend a couple of minutes talking about how solidarity split in so many directions, and then we'll finish. Of course, once again, this is a complicated story, and to boil it down into a few words, the notion of solidarity was consciously secularized, deliberately secularized, but despite that, it remains a notion fundamentally grounded in religion and one infused with a decidedly Catholic flavor. For example, Pierre Leroux, who, by the way, is the man who coined the term socialism in response to the notions of individualism, a word that Tocqueville writes in Democracy in America in 1830 is a new word. He admits that what he wanted to do was, quote, to replace the charity of Christianity with the notion of human solidarity. Leroux even went so far as to use the term communionism to distinguish his version of solidarity from any suggested by economism or communism. It reminds me a little bit of the figure of Ani Joy Holy in Wise Blood, who wanted the Church of Christ without Christ. He thought that his version of solidarity would reflect the perfection of Christianity. It was the means for bringing about the conditions of eternal life on earth. Lamennais' approach was also used by later socialists like Léon Bourgeois, who Marie-Claude Blay points out, adroitly laicized ancient religious concepts and made clever use of the mystical body celebrated by St. Paul to portray social unity. As she puts it, the Christians have some grounds to launch proceedings for usurpation. Well, some did. Ferdinand Brunetière, a Catholic convert, attacked what he called the solidarists of the left in a paper he delivered at a major conference devoted to the idea of solidarity, which was held in 1900 at the Catholic University of Toulouse. He excoriated the left for attempting to appropriate the essential principles of solidarity while doing their best to erase its Catholic roots, and the names of those who first explicated its principles. Brunetière named here Joseph de Maistre, Louis de Bonald, and Lamennais. Are our solidarists unaware of this, he demanded, or do they just pretend to be unaware of this? He then continued, if we have one Christian idea, and above all Catholic, it would be the idea of solidarity. Well, let me end then with just a couple of questions. The idea of solidarity, I think, remains an enormously powerful one, but I fear at times, increasingly, what it basically suggests is being lost. Now, the German social market as presently constituted is a direct reflection of solidarity. Its foundations go back to the theorist of solidarity. Its outlines, and Americans typically don't know this, were put together by people like Walter Eucken and the Freiburg School of Economics during the time World War II was going on. This was a joint Catholic-Protestant effort in putting this sort of thing together. Tocqueville thought that democracy was the force that couldn't be stopped in modernity, but I think he was wrong. It's the thing beneath those forces that I think can't be stopped, or at least is very difficult to stop, and that's individualism. That seems to be the thing. We've all got an iPhone today or something like it. You can drift off into your own, unassociated from everyone else. Modernity is a long argument about the character of our personhood, and it's one that the crisis of liberalism shows is not over. What I wonder about, in part, is whether the language of solidarity can any more be understood. Is it a language that Americans, and even American Catholics, whom Connor Cruz O'Brien once said were Protestants who go to Mass, or at least used to go to Mass, is it even a language that they can any longer understand? Properly understood, solidarity in its full sense is that for which humans most long. It's also the thing that modernity has tried to deny our longing for, or even the possibility of. In our time and circumstances, the question of and the need for solidarity has never been more pressing. In his last social allocution, as a matter of fact, John Paul II had members of the solidarity movement there. He urged them to continue their work, saying, solidarity is our most pressing question today. Well, in our time and circumstances, the question and the need for solidarity, I think, has never been more pressing. Our foreparents in the tradition, those who formed and brought the notion of solidarity into the world, had a very clear understanding, even 200 or 300 years ago, about where we would be headed, where we've arrived, and what will be required to reverse a long cycle of decline. This starts by asking anew, who are we? I think solidarity is a wonderful way of getting into that question. Thanks very much.